At exactly 0841 local time, 42 miles south of Kangatsiak, a Royal Danish Air Force pilot did something that had never happened in the entire recorded history of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He activated a live weapons lock on an American military aircraft. Not a training exercise, not a simulated engagement. A real AIM-9X Sidewinder with its seeker head spinning up, its infrared sensor reading heat, its onboard computer calculating kill geometry against a United States Air Force transport carrying 134 American soldiers at 18,000 feet over the Greenland ice sheet. Captain Lars Eriksson had his finger on the release. The American crew had no meaningful way out, and the alliance that had held the line against Soviet expansion for 75 years was now balanced on one Danish pilot's trigger discipline. Here's what makes this moment extraordinary beyond the obvious. The F-16 Fighting Falcon that Eriksson was flying was American-designed. The AIM-9X Sidewinder mounted on its wingtip rail was American-built. The radar warning algorithms feeding his targeting computer were derived from American avionics research. The very training he had completed to achieve weapons-qualified status came from American instructors at American bases under American doctrine. Denmark had bought into the F-16 program in 1980, 77 jets procured through a joint NATO agreement specifically designed to defend the alliance. And now all of it, every dollar of American defense technology, every hour of American instruction, was aimed at an American aircraft. The C-17 Globemaster III had departed Thule Air Base 90 minutes earlier. Her four Pratt & Whitney F117 turbofan engines, each generating 40,440 pounds of thrust, pushed 585,000 pounds of aluminum, fuel, cargo, and human beings through Arctic air at 260 knots. Inside her cargo bay, 134 Army Rangers sat strapped into canvas bench seating, facing inward. No windows, no situational awareness. No indication that anything outside the aircraft was anything other than routine. They believed they were participating in joint exercises with Greenlandic security forces. They had no idea two Danish fighters were pacing them with active missile locks. The F-16AM is not Denmark's newest aircraft. Those F-35A Lightning IIs were still arriving in theater, but it is not a relic either. The AM designation refers to the midlife update package completed in the late 1990s, which replaced the original avionics suite with a modern architecture built around the APG-66V2 fire control radar, a Link 16 tactical data link for real-time battle space sharing, and full compatibility with the AIM-9X Block 2 Sidewinder. That last detail matters enormously. The original AIM-9, introduced in the 1950s, was a rear hemisphere weapon. It needed to chase heat from an engine exhaust. The AIM-9X is a different weapon entirely. Its focal plane array seeker operates across a full 90-degree off-bore sight envelope, which means it can track targets that aren't even directly ahead of the launching aircraft. Its thrust vectoring control surfaces let the missile execute 60 G-turns that would black out any human pilot. It carries a 9.36-kilogram blast fragmentation warhead designed specifically to defeat modern fast jets. Against a C-17 with no armor and four heat-blasting turbofan engines, the engagement math was not complicated. The C-17 is not an aircraft built to lose missiles. Her AN/AAR-47 missile warning system would have detected a launch. The AN/ALE-47 countermeasure dispenser could have seeded the airspace with flares and chaff. But here is the honest assessment. AIM-9X Block 2 was specifically engineered to defeat those countermeasures. Its imaging infrared seeker distinguishes between a flare and the actual thermal profile of an engine by shape, not just temperature. Burning magnesium looks different from burning jet fuel through a focal plane array. The C-17's defensive suite was designed for a threat environment that predates the missile that was now locked onto her. The Rangers in the cargo bay had 2 seconds between warhead detonation and structural failure. Most of them would not have known what happened. 0843. The Danish flight lead transmitted on guard frequency, the emergency channel monitored by every military aircraft in the region. The transmission was not aggressive, it was clinical, which is somehow worse. American transport, you are operating in restricted Danish airspace without authorization from the Kingdom of Denmark. Alter your course immediately or defensive action will be taken. Major Rebecca Huang, commanding the C-17 from the left seat, responded with equal restraint. She cited the 1951 Defense Agreement, the bilateral treaty that had governed American military access to Greenland for over 7 decades. She cited authorization she had received from Greenland's provisional government in Nuuk. The Danes cited Copenhagen. Both sides were legally correct by the framework they had chosen to apply. That is what happens when a constitutional crisis outpaces the treaties built to prevent it. Here is the geography that matters. Kangerlussuaq sits roughly 300 kilometers north of Nuuk, Greenland's capital. Its airport, Sondraströmfjord, formerly Sondraström Air Base before that, Bluey West 8 before that, was carved out of the Arctic tundra in 1941 to support transatlantic ferry routes ferrying aircraft to the European theater. The United States operated it as a major Cold War installation through 1992. When American forces withdrew, Denmark inherited a 3,000-meter runway capable of handling anything from regional turboprops to strategic airlift. In January 2026, Copenhagen had begun fortifying it, hardened aircraft shelters, extended fuel storage, command and control infrastructure suitable for a joint Arctic headquarters. The F-16S stationed there were not a defensive gesture. They were a declaration. Denmark intended to physically enforce its Arctic sovereignty, not merely assert it through diplomatic channels. Washington had apparently calculated that Greenland's provisional government could grant landing authorization independent of Copenhagen. It was the kind of legal argument that works well in a conference room and poorly at 18,000 feet with a sidewinder locked onto your engines. The Rangers in that cargo hold were passengers on a policy disagreement with wings. 0845. The message from NORAD reached Thule. Thule transmitted to the C-17. 4 words, essentially, though transmitted in the careful language of military communications. Abort the mission immediately. Major Huang acknowledged. Began a banking turn to the northwest, away from Kangerlussuaq, away from the Danish fighters, away from the exact engagement geometry that had nearly collapsed the most consequential military alliance in modern history. Erickson watched the American transport heel over, watched the range numbers climb, watched the Sidewinder's seeker track that C-17 heat signature until distance and geometry broke the lock. His wingman called the engagement terminated. Both aircraft climbed back to their combat air patrol altitude and resumed the pattern. Nobody fired, nobody died. The crisis de-escalated inside of 4 minutes. But 4 minutes is a very long time to have your finger on a trigger. The cost accounting is where the absurdity crystallizes. Denmark expended somewhere near $60,000 in fuel and maintenance cycling 2 F-16AS through a real-world weapons lock intercept of an Allied transport. They also handed Washington a precise map of their response times, their patrol patterns, their engagement doctrine, and their actual red lines. Intelligence worth orders of magnitude more than the fuel bill, and they gave it away for free. The United States spent approximately $147,000 transporting Rangers who never left their aircraft and returned to Thule with exactly nothing accomplished. The alliance that exists to prevent exactly this kind of confrontation spent roughly $200,000 discovering that 75 years of collective defense is a conditional arrangement, not an absolute one. You could have read that lesson in any history book covering the 1956 Suez Crisis, or the 1967 Liberty Incident, or any of the dozen moments when alliance theory met territorial reality and alliance theory blinked first. Would have cost less. What actually hung over the Greenland ice sheet that morning was not a question of firepower. Both sides had adequate firepower. Both sides had American firepower, specifically, which is a detail that deserves to sit uncomfortably for a moment. The question was whether NATO Article 5 collective defense is unconditional or whether it contains an unwritten asterisk that reads, unless a member state believes its sovereign territory is being annexed. Copenhagen had decided the asterisk applied. Washington had decided it did not. And the man closest to resolving that disagreement by force was a Danish captain with a trigger under his finger and a seeker head painting 4 turbofan signatures in perfect infrared resolution. The Russians watched from their Arctic monitoring stations. The Chinese watched from Beijing. Both had intelligence assets positioned to observe a confrontation that had been building since Washington began treating Greenlandic independence as an achievable near-term policy objective. Both updated their assessments of NATO's internal cohesion. Both noted the precise threshold at which alliance solidarity converts into opposing weapons locks. That kind of intelligence, not the electronic kind, but the behavioral kind, is not something you can buy or steal. You can only observe it, and only when a genuine crisis creates the conditions for observation. Greenland created those conditions. It took 8 minutes of constitutional ambiguity and 2 F-16 willing to act on their government's orders to expose the load-bearing assumption underneath 75 years of Atlantic Alliance architecture. that allied nations share a common definition of what constitutes a threat worth shooting at. Denmark and the United States discovered they do not share that definition. They discovered it with live weapons deployed, active seekers locked, and 134 soldiers sitting in the dark with no parachutes and approximately 2 seconds of margin for error if the diplomatic math failed. The C-17 landed safely at Thule. The Rangers filed back out, mission unexecuted. The F-16S rolled into their hardened shelters. Staff officers on both sides began the laborious work of diplomatic damage control. The alliance survived the morning, but survival and reassurance are different outcomes. The alliance survived because one pilot chose restraint over action at the moment when action was mechanically available to him. That is a narrow margin to stake 75 years of collective security on. It is the margin of one person's judgment. In one cockpit, on one morning, over one island, nobody had prioritized correctly until suddenly everyone needed it simultaneously. The AIM-9X Block 2 Sidewinder weighs 85.3 kilograms fully loaded. Its maximum range in a tail-chase engagement exceeds 35 kilometers. At Mach 2.5 closure, it covers a nautical mile in roughly 2.3 seconds. In the 4 minutes that Ericsson held that weapons lock, the missile could have completed its entire engagement sequence: launch, acquisition, intercept, detonation, somewhere between 60 and 80 times over. Physics is not patient. Physics is not diplomatic. Physics does not care whether the target aircraft belongs to an ally. What stopped it was a choice. One choice held continuously for 4 minutes by one person whose training and values and orders all converged on the same answer: not yet. The lesson from Greenland is not about Arctic sovereignty or constitutional law or the terms of a 1951 defense agreement. Those are the scenery. The lesson is that military alliances are trust architectures. They function not because of treaties, which are documents, or because of shared hardware, which is equipment, but because of the accumulated confidence that your ally will not do the one thing that breaks the system. The moment that confidence becomes contingent, the moment it depends on circumstances rather than existing as a baseline, the architecture has already failed. The shooting is just the paperwork. Denmark's F-16S returned American-made weapons to their hardened shelters, having demonstrated without ambiguity that the circumstance capable of breaking that baseline confidence exists. That it can be created by a sovereignty dispute over an Arctic island with fewer than 56,000 permanent residents. That it can emerge in 8 minutes from a diplomatic miscalculation. That the Atlantic Alliance's most dangerous adversary on the morning of that intercept was not Russia, was not China, was not any external actor. It was the gap between what Washington believed it had permission to do and what Copenhagen was prepared to tolerate. Like driving 2 cars toward each other on a single-lane road and discovering that your shared driving instructor taught you completely different definitions of who has right-of-way. The physics of that situation are simple. The preparation was inadequate, and the only reason both cars made it home is that one driver blinked. He blinked because he chose to. That distinction matters more than anything else about that morning over the Greenland ice sheet.